Renee Hardy has the first question this week. And Renee says, hello there. Hello there. I just found your podcast and I've listened to the last few episodes you produced, and I have to say, you have picked up a new follower. Thank you very much, Renee. I appreciate it. She says, I love how you tell your opinion, but are willing to accept others' opinions as well. We need more fans like you. Thank you very much. I do appreciate that. She goes on to say, where was I? I keep hearing about how the EU is so much better than the new canon. I haven't read much of the new stuff because of the negativity I see surrounding it. Why do you enjoy the new canon more than the EU, and what do you see is the biggest difference between the two? Thanks for the question, Renee. And it's a really good question, and it's one that I feel like I've addressed before, but it has been a while, so we'll address it again. First off, there's a lot of negativity surrounding the new canon, and really it's, I used the term EU purist a while ago, and honestly, I shouldn't use that term. I really shouldn't. I feel like it's a derogatory term towards people who just really enjoyed the old stories, which is nothing wrong with. What I feel like there is something wrong with is enjoying the old stories, but not giving the new stories a chance at all. And granted, there's some stinkers in the new canon. There's some stuff that even I don't want on my canon shelf at all. Granted, I will give you that. But there's some really good stuff too. Now, this is coming from somebody, I've read some of the EU. I haven't read nearly all of it. I haven't read nearly half of it. But I've read more of the prominent novels. I read the Heir to the Empire trilogy, the Thrawn trilogy, for those of you who don't know. I read Kenobi, which Kenobi I think was the last one I read before I gave up on it because there was just so many coming out I couldn't keep up with it. I've read the Darth Bane trilogy, which is my absolute favorite trilogy of novels ever. And I'm not just talking Star Wars. I mean ever, of any book, any genre. Bane trilogy, fucking amazing. And I've actually started I've started collecting the old EU novels. I've got all of the Old Republic stuff in there, but I haven't read a lot of it yet. I have read all of the new canon. So this is going to be kind of a one-sided argument based off, and I read Shadows of the Empire from the EU also, which I think is one of the staples, one of the cornerstones when it comes to the old legend stuff. Because it was honestly one of the only, I think Shadows of the Empire and the Thrawn trilogy were really the only books that had an entire merchandise line behind them also, when it came to action figures and stuff like that. So, yeah, there's a little bit of a negativity when it comes, when you start talking about Star Wars canon, people tend to get a little, what's the word I want? I'll use the word pissy. People start to get pissy. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. The biggest difference between the two is, we had the EU stuff for 30 years. There's like if you want to talk about just adult novels alone, not talking comics and children's books, adult novels alone, I think there's 157 adult novels in the EU. There's like 27, I think, in canon. So there's a lot of stories that were told over the 3 decades. Stories that people really read and they really clung to. And, the Thrawn trilogy was heralded as the official continuation of the Skywalker saga. It was the official episodes, I guess you could say 4, 5, 6, before the special editions came along and made them, 7, 8, and 9. I know a lot of people really enjoyed the Thrawn trilogy. I really enjoyed the Thrawn trilogy. Really great book. But there were problems with the EU also that a lot of people tend to gloss over and they choose to ignore because it's inconvenient. Everybody talks about how George Lucas always considered the EU canon. He didn't. George Lucas never considered the EU canon. He used it as I don't want to say a breeding ground. He used it as an idea, as a ground for ideas. And really he used it basically just to make sure that names weren't used before and stuff like that. And the biggest example I can use is this. And a lot of people argue with me until I bring this up. And a lot of people have been bringing this up lately. If George Lucas considered the EU canon, why did we get the Clone Wars that we got in the films? Why wasn't it the Clone Wars that was mentioned in the Thrawn trilogy, where there were actual clones of Jedi? Why didn't that happen? So George Lucas never considered the EU canon. I think he considered parts of it as kind of, yeah, okay, well, we can say that happened. I think he really ran with the idea of having the Skywalker twins again, the Solo twins, I should say, Jason and Jaina, and then Anakin later on. I think he really did grasp onto that idea quite a bit. But for the most part, the EU was never considered canon. It never, and it had layers of canon, which, granted, the new canon has got layers of canon too, whether they want to admit it or not. It does have layers of canon also. But the old EU was really contradictory. I mean, extremely contradictory. There were stories popping up of characters that had died in other book series later on, and it's just a lot of stuff that just didn't mesh well. And yeah, there's people out there like those stories, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you have to admit that there were problems with it as well. It's not this all perfect. It's not all 157 novels were absolutely perfect. They weren't. There were some really bad things in there. As far as the new canon goes, there's some bad stuff in the new canon. There's some really good stuff in the new canon, but there is some really shitty stuff in the new canon. Stuff that to be completely honest, I've never read the last 2 issues of Chewbacca. I've got all 5 issues. I've got them bagged and boarded in my long box, but I've never read the last 2 issues. I ended up giving up on that comic. It's just shit. It's just absolute shit. Heir to the Jedi is a book that I don't like to mention because I feel my blood pressure go up every time I mention it. Heir to the Jedi was the 3rd book released in the new canon, and it was really grandfathered in because it was supposed to be part of the Legends of the EU. And it got grandfathered in. It was tweaked here and there so it matched canon, and then it was just brought in. Horrible book. The comic for C-3PO and the Phantom Limb, how he got his red arm, they told that story in the Lego Star Wars Force Awakens game, and it made more sense in Lego than it did on the comic page. That was a horrible... I mean, the artwork in that comic was just horrible. Last Shot, wasn't a big fan of Last Shot at all by Daniel Jose Older. I mentioned that earlier. It had too many time jumps in it, just back and forth all over the place. Not a big fan of Most Wanted. Not a big fan of the new Lando 5-issue run, the Double or Nothing. Not a big fan of that. Basically, anything that came out about the time Solo came out, not a huge fan of. Wasn't a huge fan of the first Aftermath. I've grown to appreciate it for what it is at this point. Wasn't a fan of Alphabet Squadron, but still excited to see where that series ends up going. There's some things in the new canon that I'm not a fan of. And I don't sit here and preach and say the new canon is better than the EU. I'm not going to say that. I will say that the new canon is more cohesive than the old EU was. Not completely. There's still things that contradict themselves in the new canon. There's still contradictory things. Don't get me wrong. But it is nowhere near as bad as the EU was. And yeah, there's some really good stories in the EU that should be brought into canon. There's some damn good stories. There's some stories in the EU that I'm sad are not canon anymore. But at the same time, you have to... I don't like the word headcanon. I know a lot of people use the word headcanon quite a bit now. And I'm not a big fan of it. But what is canon is canon. As much as fans want to bitch and moan and complain that the new canon is ruining their childhood and all this stuff, Disney owns it. Disney owns it. Yes, I know fans say, no, Star Wars belongs to the fans. It really does. Not legally. It doesn't legally belong to you. Legally, it belongs to Disney, and they can do whatever they want with the story. They can do whatever they want with it, and that is canon, whether you like it or not. There are things I wish wasn't canon, but it is, whether I like it or not. It doesn't... We don't get the final say. They should... I think they should take fan criticism into account, but they don't think they should do what the fans say. I really don't think they should. So, yeah, there are differences between the EU and the canon, and one of the biggest ones, as far as format goes, there were a lot of stories that really centered around Han, Luke, and Leia. I mean, bulk of them centered around Han, Luke, and Leia, Chewie, Lando, the droids, in the EU, and their kids. Those are the stories, and Mara Jade. Mara Jade's one of those characters that everybody has this like, let's just like Star Wars boner for, and it's crazy to see how many people love that character. But a good bulk of those stories centered around that time period, and that's why a lot of people love these stories so much. That's why they were better, I think. And when you look at the new canon, there's not a single novel that has come out in the new canon that is a Han, Luke, Leia, Lando droid story. There's not a single one. There are novelizations, if you want to call them that, for episodes 4, 5, and 6. The Princess, Scoundrel, and the Farm Boy, So You Want to Be a Jedi, and Beware the Dark Side of the Force. Those are basically novelizations. They're horrible novelizations, but they're basically novelizations. That's as close as you got. There is nothing else in the new canon anywhere that has Han, Luke, Leia, Lando, and the droids. Nothing along the same lines as what the EU was. And we need some of that. Don't get me wrong. There's a Han and Lando novel. There's a Leia novel. There's nothing with those three teaming up to fight the next big baddie. And really with the old canon, they really focused on the big three and that A team of characters during that time period. And now with this new canon during this time period, we've got so many new characters, so many more badass A teams, that now Han, Luke, and Leia have kind of lost their luster a little bit as far as heroes are concerned. So when you start focusing, and granted, you have to expand the universe, you have to tell more stories, but you need to have a central core of storytelling around those characters. Those are the ones people love the most. And we have nothing on Luke Skywalker. Literally nothing on Luke Skywalker. No Luke novels at all. We have the Legends of Luke Skywalker, but all of that was tossed up for debate whether it was canon or not. The only things we know about Luke as far as in between episodes 6 and 7 are he went to, I don't remember the name of the planet now, in Battlefront, when he went and got that compass at the Emperor's Observatory. We know he was there, and we know he started a Jedi training facility, and we know he trained Ben Solo. And that's basically all we know. We don't, everything else is kind of left up for debate. We need more stuff that really brings those characters together, and there's no reason we can't. Even in the canon now, they could still do it. There's still a huge time gap between Last Shot and Bloodline, which is really the main novels there. There's still like a 20-year time gap there where you could still tell stories with Han, Luke, Leia, Lando, and the droids. And Chewie, there's that gap there. And I think if they actually got somebody to sit down and write those stories, they could really feel a lot like EU novels. Start telling stories about some of the things that they were dealing with at the time and these other remnants of the Empire, even though I know the Empire died at the Battle of Jakku now. I get that. But you would still, I guarantee you still have these holdouts. These Imperial governors that don't want to give up their power on the planet that they live on. They still have garrisons of troops that never made it to the Battle of Jakku. Even though they got the call to go, there were still Imperial governors that, no, don't think so. There were still admirals out there. Whatever happened to Admiral Ray Sloan? We don't know whatever happened to Sloan. So she could be the next big baddie for Han, Luke, and Leia to deal with. So there's still so much more that they could tell and to make this thing still seem like the EU. The new canon is focused a lot on bringing some of the newer characters to light, like the Ahsoka novel, stuff like that, and this Kira from the Solo film with Most Wanted, and they've brought Thrawn back, which you really can't not complain that they brought Thrawn back. Bringing Thrawn back was the best move you could have made. So there are a lot of differences between the two. The bulk of the negativity, I think, comes from people being attached to those stories and being told, no, those stories never happened. Well, I can see where they're coming from. They did happen. I read them. That's fine, but they didn't actually happen in our universe. But I read them. That's fine. Nobody's coming to take your EU collection and burn it and saying you're not allowed to read it anymore. They're not doing that. If people out there love the EU so much and they hate everything Disney's done so much, you still have your EU novels. There's nothing stopping you from saying that's the timeline you choose to go with. That's cool. That's great, whatever. Legally, Disney's got the final say in what's canon, and this is canon now. So there like, if you haven't read a lot of it, a good place to start is Lost Stars. That's a really good jumping off point. It's a novel by Claudia Gray I talked about earlier. It's a really good jumping off point. Lords of the Sith is a good jumping off point. I know some people didn't like Lords of the Sith, but I really enjoyed Lords of the Sith quite a bit. Tarkin's a good one. Bloodline's a good one. So they're really good places where you can really jump off and see what was going on in the galaxy. So Renee, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for being a follower now. And thank you for sending in the question.